This summer, on July 31st to be exact, Ric Flair will wrestle his last match. Yep. Some of you might be thinking, but wait a minute, didn't he already do that? He did. He sure did. So, I'm not going to talk about all the reasons this event shouldn't be happening, all the things that make it a cynical and exploitative example of pro wrestling at its worst, all the health issues that Ric Flair, who is 73 years old, has dealt with over the past few years that make working a wrestling match at this point in his life questionable to say the least, all the things that make Ric Flair kind of a shitty human being who other people shouldn't be throwing money at regardless of his health status. Not going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about the fact that this event is being promoted in conjunction with a fan convention run by Flair's son-in-law, podcast host and mortgage broker Conrad Thompson, a man who these last few years has somehow risen to become the biggest carny in the wrestling business despite never actually having worked in the wrestling business. Instead of any of that, I'm going to focus on one particular reason why this event shouldn't be happening. It's a creative reason, an artistic reason. It has to do with storytelling. After all, pro wrestling is a form of theater. It is drama that imitates sport, and as such, story is of utmost importance. And one of the most important elements of any story is the ending. That's what Ric Flair seems to be after here, creatively speaking. He wants to write an ending to his epic pro wrestling career. He wants to step into the ring one final time and bring his decades in the wrestling business to a thrilling, satisfying, and altogether fitting conclusion. It's an understandable desire, one to which I'm sure any artist, whatever their chosen field, can relate. There's just one problem with Ric Flair's plan to cap off his wrestling career with one last match. He already did that at WrestleMania, in the Citrus Bowl, in front of 70,000 people, in 2008. It was the kind of ending wrestlers dream about. A featured match at the biggest show of the year. Flair was well past his prime at that point, but still capable of turning in a good performance. His opponent was Shawn Michaels, one of the all-time greats, who was nearing the end of a late career renaissance. The build-up to the match had been solid. The stipulation was established that if Flair lost, he would have to retire. He had gone on WWE TV and sworn that he would never retire. Shawn Michaels, for his part, had promised to put Ric Flair out of his misery like Old Yeller. The match itself was very good. Flair lost in heroic and memorable fashion, falling to a super kick from Michaels after staggering to his feet and raising his fists, determined to fight on. He left the ring to a thunderous ovation from the crowd, and the next night, on WWE's flagship TV show Monday Night Raw, Flair was sent off into retirement with one of the sloppiest and most energetically delivered blowjobs in the history of professional wrestling, as numerous wrestlers, including legends who had crossed paths with Flair throughout his career, came out to celebrate him. There were hugs and tears and words of appreciation, and at the end of it, Flair was allowed to leave the stage with dignity, his head held high. It was damn near perfect. And apparently, it wasn't good enough for Ric Flair. The year after his storybook ending, Flair returned to the ring to wrestle Hulk Hogan in a series of matches on a tour of Australia. The following year, in 2010, Flair signed with TNA, now known as Impact Wrestling, where he wrestled a dozen more matches over the next year and a half, all but one on TV or pay-per-view. His final match this time, a loss to Sting on an episode of Impact in September of 2001. I just watched that one again recently. The ending is unnecessarily overbooked, but other than that, it's not a terrible match. It's not good. It's not even one of the top 5 best Flair versus Sting matches I've ever seen. Nowhere near as good a match as Flair versus Michaels at WrestleMania. And it wasn't promoted as Flair's last match, so no matter how you slice it, it was a far less impressive ending to Flair's in-ring career than the previous ending he got. And yet, it's difficult to imagine how Flair's upcoming last match is going to meet even that relatively modest standard. He's 73, he hasn't worked a match in nearly 11 years. How could there possibly be an ending as satisfying as the one Flair got in 2008 at this point? Wouldn't it have been better to just let the good ending stand? And given the fact that Flair didn't do that, instead of coming back for the sole purpose of trying to write a better ending, wouldn't it be better to just leave well enough alone? Which brings me to Star Trek, and specifically to the upcoming third season of Star Trek Picard. As you may have heard, the third season of Star Trek Picard will be the final season, and it will see the return of not just Jean-Luc Picard, but the entire cast of Star Trek The Next Generation. And according to both showrunner Terry Matalas and series co-creator and current grand poobah of the Star Trek franchise, Alex Kurtzman, these will not be cameos from the TNG cast, but substantial roles in the show that will comprise, in the words of Matalas, quote, a proper send-off for the TNG crew. There's just one problem with this plan by the producers of Star Trek Picard to give the cast of Star Trek The Next Generation a proper send-off. That's already been done. Twice. As was the case with Ric Flair's wrestling career, the first ending written for the TNG crew was just about perfect. I'm talking about the finale of the TV series, All Good Things, which to this day is still the best series finale of any Star Trek show, and one of the best series finales of any show. It tells a satisfying story centered on Captain Picard. It feels appropriately epic. It features Q in a meaningful role that calls back to the first episode of the series. The plot allows Picard and us to visit the past, the present, and the future, or a possible future anyway, giving the whole thing a sweeping, comprehensive quality. And it has that perfect final scene that pays off something which we didn't even know had been set up. It probably wasn't set up intentionally, it just worked out that way, where Captain Picard joins his crew in their poker game for the first time. Such a good ending, right? I watched TNG during its original airing from the very beginning, so when I watched All Good Things the first time, it was the culmination of a 7-year run that actually took 7 years to complete. It was the destination at the end of, and I hesitate to use this particular phrase in reference to Star Trek, but here we go, a long road. And it was everything I could have hoped for. Alas, it was not destined to last. And here's where we bump up against the biggest flaw in this comparison between Ric Flair and Star Trek. Unlike Flair's post-WrestleMania retirement in 2008, we knew ahead of time that the ending of All Good Things wasn't going to stick. We knew that later that same year, the cast of TNG was coming back for their first movie, Star Trek Generations. So while All Good Things delivers an immensely satisfying resolution to the adventures of the crew of the Enterprise D, it was only ever promoted as the ending to the TV series, not to the overall story of these characters. And sure, Ric Flair coming out of retirement after 2008 wasn't exactly unprecedented. The stipulations of wrestling matches are no less fictional than any other fiction in pro wrestling, and as such are easily undone, and retirement stipulations are no exception. I expect it's accurate to say that most high-profile wrestlers who have ridden off into the sunset after retirement matches have come trotting back into town before too long. Hell, at this point, I'm pretty sure Terry Funk has had at least half as many retirement matches as he's had matches. But that being said, Flair's retirement after WrestleMania in 2008 was presented as being permanent. It's not as if he lost his retirement match at WrestleMania, had his big send-off on Raw the next night, but we all knew he was booked to wrestle later that year at SummerSlam. So my comparison of Ric Flair to Star Trek is not without its problems. Go figure. Just wanted to acknowledge that. Now then, Much like Ric Flair's unremarkable second ending against Sting in 2011, the Star Trek TNG crew got another, far more lackluster farewell several years after All Good Things. It came in the form of the 2002 film Star Trek Nemesis. And it was bad. How bad? Opinions vary, of course, but for my money, Nemesis is by far the worst Star Trek movie produced to date. That covers a lot of territory. I also consider Star Trek V and Star Trek Generations to be pretty rotten, although Star Trek V is rotten in an over-the-top so-bad-it's-good way, and Generations at least gives us the opportunity to see the Enterprise D sets one last time, shot in widescreen and liberated from the flat, sterile lighting of the TV series, which is neat. Nemesis doesn't even have those dubious qualities. It's a dull, derivative, depressing couple of hours, and when it reaches its conclusion, it doesn't feel like a bittersweet goodbye to a departing friend, more like a sad but inevitable act of euthanasia. I watch it now, and I think, Jesus, no wonder they didn't make another Star Trek movie for 7 years after this. So I understand the desire from both Ric Flair and the producers of Star Trek to come back and do yet another ending to rinse away the bad taste of the previous ones. I get it. They had great endings. They blew those endings by coming back. They then had second endings that were nowhere near as satisfying as the first ones. So now they want to come back one more time to really get it right with a final ending. Swear to God, this is it. This time we're not kidding. However, I think it's a bad idea in both cases, and for the same basic reason. We've been there already. Actually, with both Ric Flair's last match and the TNG crew send-off, we've been there twice already. Repetition can be an effective tool for storytelling if it's used carefully and intentionally. Repetition that is done in an attempt to correct a mistake is almost never a good idea. A basic tenet of pro wrestling is, or used to be anyway, don't repeat a blown spot. In other words, if something in your wrestling match doesn't go as intended, just move on and do something else, instead of trying to do it again. Repeating the spot draws the audience's attention to two things, both of which are undesirable. First, that you fucked up, and second, that they're not watching an actual fight, which they already know, presumably, if they're watching a wrestling show in the year 2022, but it's still not a good practice to remind them of it. We all know movies are fake too, but filmmakers still relegate the flubs to the blooper reel. Repeating something to try and make up for a past failure also lessens the dramatic impact of whatever you're trying to do. There's an instructive recent example of this in the Star Trek franchise, which, upon reflection, now feels like a small-scale rehearsal for what the producers are apparently planning for Season 3 of Star Trek Picard. At the end of Season 1 of Star Trek Picard, we learn that the entire season has been building up to the death of Data, one of the most beloved characters in all of the Star Trek franchise. In the season finale, Picard, whose consciousness has been temporarily transferred into a simulation, encounters Data, who, unbeknownst to Picard, has been alive in this state for at least a little while, his consciousness having been reconstructed from salvaged bits of his memory following his apparent death at the end of Nemesis. At the end of their conversation, Data asks Picard to help him end his life. Picard, reluctant but understanding, agrees, and later we see Picard and the others gather together to shut down Data's consciousness for, presumably, the last time. In the simulation, comforted by an image of Picard, Data grows old and dies. It's a very well-done scene, nicely written, beautifully acted by Patrick Stewart and Brent Spiner. There's just one problem with the producers of Star Trek Picard writing a story that culminates in the death of Data. It had already been done 18 years earlier in Star Trek Nemesis. And the fact that we're seeing something we've already seen really hurts that scene, which is otherwise perhaps the strongest single scene in Star Trek Picard's wildly uneven first season. Yes, it's sad and poignant and everyone involved seems to be giving it their all, but there's no getting around the fact that we've done this already. It's hard to get too invested in the death of Data when Data's been dead for almost 20 years already. That his first death isn't particularly well done doesn't really factor in. The most important thing is it happened. It wasn't done well, but it was done, which means that any attempt to redo it, even if that attempt is artistically superior to the first one, will come across as redundant. So that's my concern for Ric Flair's last match and the proper send-off to the TNG crew in Picard Season 3. Well, that's my concern creatively speaking. The Flair thing is going to be a shit show for all sorts of other reasons. I get wanting to do it. I get wanting to go out on a high note, but you did that already. You spent that nickel, and you blew it. Better to just leave it alone. If nothing else, this should be a lesson for all storytellers to take to heart. Stick to your endings, especially if they're good, but even if they don't work out the way you hoped they would, resist the temptation to come back and try again, because whether it's a success or a disaster, an ending should be like losing your virginity or donating a kidney and only happen once.